Let's talk about education a little bit. And Senator Hann, I know that you're very involved in the Education Committee in the Minnesota Senate. Again, back on the campaign trail last fall, we heard an awful lot about education and the needs of education, funding for education, test scores, measurements, accountability, and QComp, and all of that.
Right.
What are your views in terms of where you think education ought to be going?
Well, I think you're right. Most of us did hear a lot about education. I came off of a school board in Eden Prairie prior to being elected to the Senate. I think you talk to different senators around the state, and everyone will tell you that education is an important issue, maybe the most important issue. It's the single biggest thing that we spend money on at the state budget. And there are a lot of concerns about the funding, whether it is being done in a way that meets the needs of local jurisdictions. There are a lot of policy issues involved. QComp, you mentioned, is one that the governor's initiative to deal with what I guess you could think of as merit pay for teachers. There are a number of districts that have adopted QComp proposals. These are agreements between local bargaining units and administrations to try to find ways to change the compensation structure of teachers. And I think it's been an experiment that is still a little bit too early to tell whether we're going to see some benefit. And the thing that we're hearing in our budget committee is that I think there's some sentiment on the part of the Democrats to say it's time to close down the experiment. And I think we're a little bit concerned about that. We think that we ought to give this a chance to see if it yields any results, and we're hoping that we can persuade our DFL colleagues to give this a little bit more time to be tested.
I think it was a much needed experiment, and
Yes.
I certainly agree with you. It's way too early to close it down. I actually would like to see more school districts participate, because I think that's when you'll see if QComp really works. And I think another thing that we both agree is that we're hearing a ton about is special education costs. There really isn't a good way to fund special education. I think that's something we're all aware of, but we're trying to find better ways. We're looking at how to make sure every student's needs are met without overspending on certain students, so that we're paying back another district. When we have open enrollment for special education, it works in many ways, but it causes problems in others. And so you see some districts with pretty heavy enrollment in special education and others not so much. And it gets to be a very difficult thing from district to district. But I think another piece about education that gets very complicating is that we have such huge differences from district to district. I, for instance, in my Elk River district, had a growth in the student body. There was over 600 new students in 1 year, and yet on the north end of my district, I have school districts that are declining in enrollment. And so it gets to be pretty tough for the districts to deal with those things. But I think the best thing we can do is square away the education formula, fund the base of the student the best, and slow down on the categoricals, actually take out some of the categoricals and fund education in a more rational way.
And I think there's been, Senator Senjem, you probably are aware too, that there's been some effort in the last couple of years to try to make that formula a little bit more understandable to people. It's very complicated. And I think that part of our mission as Republicans is to try to get the discussion on education to be focused on what are the results that people are seeing in the schools. I think too often we look at the amount of money being spent as an indicator of how good a job we're doing in education, and yet that really is not the right metric, I don't believe. I think that part of our job as Republicans is to try to keep the discussion focused on what is actually being accomplished. Are students achieving what we expect them to achieve? And how do we know that? And those discussions, unfortunately, are a little bit more difficult to have. They're harder to get at. It's much easier to say, well, how much money do we spend, and to use that as a proxy for determining how good a job we're doing. But we need to work harder at making sure we're getting the results that we expect.
I think it's fair to say that, at least from the standpoint of our caucus, we would be thinking not necessarily in terms of certainly funding is important. We all recognize that. We want to fund our schools adequately. But as you say, beyond that, results, and we'd be looking for results in terms of how well our students are doing, what the outcomes are. I would also say, since this is going to play to a large segment of rural Minnesota, and I think Senator Wergin pointed out the funding formula itself and the various differences. If you're, for instance, a Twin Cities student, we will probably pay that student, or at least the school, $11,000, $12,000 to educate that student, where in greater Minnesota it's down around $6,000. And some of us have trouble understanding totally that difference, and thus I think you'll be seeing our caucus working on that formula, trying to get some better equity and some more equalization with respect to how we fund kids across Minnesota, not necessarily only in the urban areas. Let's move on, if we could, a little bit to transportation. We don't have a lot of time left, but maybe we can just touch on it, since Senator Hann, in his introductory comments, touched on it, and we're both sort of in these urban cores,
right.
And it is affecting us.
Well, and I think transportation is one of those issues that probably there are more differences of view depending on what part of the state you're from, and it may not be quite so much Republican and Democrat. Yeah. I know the district I represent, a suburban district, lots of concern about the the interstate, the freeway system. We've had some improvement in that in the last couple of years. The governor has done, we think, a pretty good job of putting together some pretty substantial transportation budgets the last 4 years, and we certainly have seen some effect of that out in my district. But in the metro area, there's so much movement between one suburb and another, between the downtown areas and the exurban suburban areas, and the difficulty that people have getting around has really made that issue important. Part of that component is the transit component, whether it's buses or light rail. Those are things that are being debated. My own preference is that we need to get caught up and work harder at making sure that the basic road infrastructure is in place, and I know that we may differ about the division of those monies, but transportation continues to be a major issue for us and across the state.
Any quick comments on our work?
It definitely is across the state. We have a lot of two-lane highways, state highways in my district that could use some repair and stuff. So we do need to continue to look for ways. But I'm glad that you mentioned that we have done really a good job of bonding for highways and stuff. And we've had 3 consecutive largest construction seasons in the history of Minnesota. And I think that speaks well for this administration.
Well, that wraps it up for today. We look forward to being with you again. Other members perhaps speaking to you on behalf of our caucus. I want to remind all of the viewers that this is your government, and we need you to be involved in it. And so as you have questions about policy issues that you might hear about, read about, feel free to call your senator. And we're going to be flashing phone numbers on the screen as this program concludes. And again, thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again.
All of the senators at the Senate Republican Caucus encourage you to get involved in your state government. Be aware of current events. Call them at the Senate Republican Caucus in St. Paul at 651-296-1930. Thanks for watching. Your Minnesota Senate in short.